What happens when a war-scarred cowboy ready to die in the snow is dragged into a hidden canyon shelter by an exiled Apache woman who orders, "Get in now." As riders close in, will she betray him to survive or risk everything to protect the stranger she saved? The wind was a blade honed sharp on the distant frozen peaks and driven into the canyon with a fury that felt personal. It tore through the threadbare wool of my greatcoat, seeking out the old saber wound in my side and twisting it with a familiar searing pain. Each gust threatened to sweep my legs from under me. I pressed my back against the cold, unyielding stone of the canyon wall, the granite, seeming to leach the last of my warmth. My name is Caleb Hayes, and I had come to this God-forsaken place to die. 3 days. It had been 3 days since my horse, a good steady gelding named Dusty, had finally surrendered to the cold, sinking to his knees in a drift with a sigh that frosted the air. I'd stayed with him until the end, my hand on his neck, feeling the life tremble and then still. Taking his saddlebags was a betrayal. I could barely stomach, but survival. Even a survival I no longer wanted has its own brutal logic. Now the only weight that kept me anchored to the earth was the Colt in my holster and the heavier burden of my past. The war had taken more than just a piece of my side. It had taken the man I was supposed to be. It had burned my farm in Missouri to the ground and put my Mary in the earth long before her time. When I came back, there was nothing left but ghosts and whispers. I drifted, taking odd jobs, my hands calloused from labor but my soul worn smooth with indifference. I ended up in a town full of men who remembered debts I couldn't pay and favors I wouldn't grant. One too many dark looks, one too many nights waking up in a cold sweat with the faces of the dead staring back at me from the dark, and I'd simply walked away. I pointed myself west into the wilderness with no destination but a way. Now a way had led me here. The snow swirled in a hypnotic white blur and my thoughts grew thick and slow. The pain in my side had become a dull, constant throb, a companion through the long, cold nights spent huddled under rock ledges. I was tired. Not just tired of walking, but a deep, bone-weary exhaustion with the whole business of breathing. This canyon with its sheer, indifferent walls seemed as good a place as any to lie down and let the winter have its way. It was then through the haze of snow and despair that I saw it. A door. It was so out of place, so impossible, that for a moment I thought the cold had finally cracked my mind. It wasn't a cabin, not in any way I understood. It was a dugout carved directly into the canyon wall, low and nearly invisible. The entrance framed with rough-hewn planks that looked like driftwood. As I stared, the door opened. A figure emerged into the biting wind, and the sight of her jolted me with a clarity that cut through my fatigue. She was small, thin, in a way that spoke of hunger, but she stood firm against the gale. A coarse blanket was wrapped around her shoulders, the ends whipping around her like angry spirits. Her hair was a river of unbound black, and her eyes, even from a distance, were dark and sharp. She was Apache, that much was clear from her high cheekbones and the proud set of her jaw. She studied me, her gaze direct and unflinching, the way a rancher might study a sick calf, calculating its chances. I could almost see the thoughts flicker across her face. He won't last the hour. I saw that plain as day. Then came another, quieter and more complex. Bringing him in could be the end of me too. I knew the risk I represented. A white man, a drifter, was nothing but trouble, a magnet for patrols and posses. I braced myself for her to turn away, to shut the door and leave me to the elements. It was what I would have done. It was the sensible thing to do. But she didn't. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady, cutting through the howl of the wind. "Cowboy," she said, the word shaped with a careful, deliberate effort. "We are shivering. Get in my shelter. Now." The words were an order, not an invitation. There was no pity in her tone, only a stark, undeniable authority. Before I could process it, before I could even think to refuse, she was moving toward me. She hooked a slender arm under mine, and I was shocked by the strength in her small frame as she pulled. My legs, barely holding me, threatened to give way completely. I stumbled, my worn boots dragging through the snow, my weight. A dead thing she was determined to move. She pulled me through the doorway, and the world outside vanished. The heavy plank door thudded shut, and the roar of the wind was instantly replaced by a thick, pressing silence. Darkness folded in, broken only by the soft orange glow of a small fire burning in a shallow pit. The air was heavy with the smell of wood smoke, damp leather, and something else. The faint, earthy scent of beans simmering in a pot. I leaned against the wall, my breath coming in ragged, painful rasps. My eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom. The space was impossibly small, more a den than a room. Rough shelves were hacked directly into the stone walls. A line was strung across one corner, hung with a few meager pieces of clothing. A wooden crate, likely holding her food supply, sat near the fire. It was a place of pure survival, stripped of all comfort and sentiment. My gaze fell back to the woman. She had dropped the blanket, and now in the flickering firelight I could see her more clearly. She was younger than I'd first thought, perhaps not much more than 24 or 25, but her face was etched with lines of hardship that made her seem ageless. Her dress was made of some rough, dark cloth, torn at the shoulder seam and frayed at the hem. As she knelt by the fire, the neckline gaped, revealing the elegant line of her collarbone. A long rip ran up the side of her skirt, exposing a length of strong, well-muscled thigh. There was nothing of vanity in her state of undress. It was the simple, honest wear and tear of a hard life. And yet there was a raw, undeniable beauty about her, a beauty as rugged and untamed as the canyon itself. She dipped a rag into the steaming pot, wrung it out, and came toward me. I flinched, a lifetime of caution screaming at me, but I was too weak to move away. She pressed the warm, damp cloth to a cut on my eyebrow I hadn't even realized was bleeding. The sting was sharp, and I winced, but I held still. Her fingers were steady, careful, and completely unafraid. A thought, distant and strange, surfaced in my mind. When was the last time someone touched me without anger? The question hung in the smoky air unanswered. It might have been before the war. I truly couldn't remember. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice quiet. Her English was precise, each word an object she examined before releasing. "It'll stop," I muttered, my own voice. A rusty croak. I felt a sudden urgent need to explain myself, to tell her why I was here, but the words were a tangled knot in my throat. I wasn't even sure I knew the answers myself anymore. She ignored my protest and returned to the fire, ladling a thick stew of beans into a clay bowl. She handed it to me. "Eat," she commanded gently. "Then talk." I took the bowl, my hand trembling so badly I almost dropped it. The beans were plain, seasoned with nothing more than salt and maybe a wild herb. But the moment the first spoonful touched my lips, a wave of profound relief washed over me, so intense my chest ached. I forced myself to eat slowly, deliberately. I was a starving man, but I would not let myself appear like a ravenous animal in front of her. Not after she had shown me this kindness. She took a smaller portion for herself and sat on the other side of the fire pit, watching me over the rim of her bowl. Her gaze was constant, analytical. I could feel her weighing the risk she'd taken. A white man in her shelter could bring soldiers, could bring her own people in punishment. I saw the calculation in her eyes and felt a pang of guilt. But I also saw something else in her gaze. I saw the exhaustion in my own trembling hands, the hollows in my cheeks, the deep-set scar along my jaw that the firelight threw into stark relief. She saw a man who had been broken long before she found him, and some part of her, some deeply buried instinct for compassion, had refused to leave me to die on the canyon floor. The warmth of the fire seeped into my bones, a slow creeping comfort. The weight of her stare was a tangible thing. I knew what she was doing. She was measuring me, trying to decide if I was worth the trouble, worth the danger. I found myself wondering the same thing about her. Could she be trusted? Or would she trade my life for her own safety at the first opportunity? I looked from the fire to the rough-hewn shelves and then to her. For the first time in months, perhaps years, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel, a tiny, fragile filament of connection. Maybe there was a reason to keep moving after all. Maybe, just maybe, there was a reason to stay alive. The silence between us was not easy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the unspoken questions of two people whose worlds had collided in the heart of a storm. It was the beginning of something neither of us could have possibly understood. I woke to the scrape of metal against stone. The fire had been stoked and the dugout was filled with a welcome smoky warmth. My back was a solid sheet of pain from the hard-packed earth, and every breath sent a sharp reminder from the old wound in my side. But for the first time in a long time, I hadn't woken up cold. For a disoriented moment, I didn't know where I was. Then I saw her. She was kneeling by the fire, her back to me. Her long black hair cascaded down her back, a stark contrast to the rough gray blanket that had slipped from one shoulder. She was pouring boiling water from a blackened pot into a tin cup, her movements economical and precise. I watched her in silence, noticing details my exhausted mind had missed the night before. This dugout wasn't just a hole scraped from the earth. It was a home of a sort. The shelves, while crude, had been cut smooth enough to hold clay jars without them tipping. The floor around the sleeping area, a slightly raised platform covered with furs, was swept clean. The fire pit was ringed with carefully selected stones angled just so to guide the smoke up toward a crack in the ceiling that served as a chimney. This wasn't luck. This was survival shaped by intelligence and relentless patience. I shifted, trying to find a less painful position, and the small grunt of pain that escaped my lips was enough to make her turn. Her eyes, dark and steady, met mine. Without a word, she came over and handed me the tin cup. "Coffee," she said. "Strong." I nodded my thanks, my voice still a rasp. "Caleb," I said. "My name is Caleb Hayes." She considered this for a moment, then gave a slight nod of her own. "Tala." I wrapped my hands around the cup, the heat a welcome sting against my palms. "You've been here long, Tala?" I asked, the question coming out before I'd thought it through. She turned her gaze back to the fire. "Since the first snows," she answered, her voice low. 4 moons. I do not count the days. 4 months. The thought settled in my gut with a leaden weight. 4 months alone in this crevice in the earth with nothing but what she could hunt, gather, or steal. Hunted by her own people, no less. I'd nearly given up after 3 days. The sheer tenacity of it was staggering. I wanted to ask why. Why had they cast her out? But the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she held herself as if braced for a blow, stopped me. I knew what exile felt like. I carried my own version of it with every step I took. As if sensing my unspoken question, she turned the inquiry back on me. "Why are you here?" "Caleb Hayes. This canyon is far from the white man's towns." I stared into the black liquid in my cup, the steam warming my face. I watched my own reflection, a haggard, bearded stranger. "I left town with a whole lot of nothing," I said, the words feeling thin and foolish spoken aloud. "No work, no horse, no prospects. I just kept walking." I paused, the truth of it feeling incomplete. I fought in the war. When it was over, there wasn't a place for me anymore. Not back home. Not anywhere. Been drifting since. She studied me, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. She knew I was holding back. My body told a more honest story than my words. The livid scar tissue on my side that I couldn't help but favor, the slight limp I tried to hide, the lines around my eyes that had been carved by more than just sun and wind. I wasn't just wandering. I was running. I felt a sudden need to shift the focus away from myself. "You live out here alone. How do you keep safe?" Her expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "I keep low," she said, her voice flat. "I watch the canyon rim. I know the hiding places. My people." She paused, choosing her words with immense care. "They do not forgive easily. If they find me, they will finish what they started." The steel in her voice was unmistakable. I didn't push for details. Instead, I gestured vaguely at the dugout. "You built this place yourself. Not all of it. My father knew of it. It was used by trappers long ago. When they left, I took it." She sat back on her heels, pulling the blanket tighter around her. "It is not a home," she said, her eyes fixed on the flames. "It is only a place to not die." Those words struck me with the force of a physical blow. A place to not die. I thought of the farm in Missouri, of the ashes and the small wooden cross I never got to see. I knew exactly what she meant. For years, that's all I had been doing, living in a place to not die. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the sharp, assessing silence of our first meeting. It was a shared quiet, the kind that settles between two people who recognize a similar wound in each other, even if they don't speak of it. Tala finally rose, pulling a small deerskin sack from one of the shelves. "The beans are almost gone. We will need water." She looked at me, then a clear challenge in her eyes. "You can walk." "I can walk," I grunted. And with a surge of effort, I pushed myself to my feet, using the wall for support. My body screamed in protest, but I forced it to obey. I would not be a burden. At the door, she paused, her hand on the heavy wooden bar that locked it. "One thing," she said, her gaze locking with mine. "If riders come, white men or my people, you do not speak. You do not show yourself. You are a ghost." "Understand, I understand," I said, my voice firm. I met her dark, steady eyes and held them. When she lifted the bar and pushed the door open, the cold was a physical shock. The world outside was a blinding expanse of white under a pale, unforgiving Sunday. I squinted against the glare, my boots sinking into the fresh snow as I followed her down a barely there trail toward the sound of running water. She moved with a sureness that belied her small size, her feet finding purchase on the slick, snow-dusted rocks. She carried a heavy clay jug, the blanket, now tied securely around her waist. I watched her and I saw that her head was never still. Her eyes constantly scanned the rim of the canyon above her ears, tuned to any sound that was out of place. She was a creature of this wilderness, alert, and alive in a way I had forgotten how to be. At the creek she knelt and used a sharp stone to break the thin sheet of ice that had formed near the bank. As she filled the jug, I kept watch, my hand resting on the butt of my Colt, a habit I couldn't break. The creek gurgled and hissed, the only sound in the vast silence. As she stood up, her foot slipped on a patch of ice. The heavy jug pulled her off balance. I reacted without thinking, my hand shooting out to grab her elbow, steadying her. She didn't pull away. For a brief, suspended moment, her eyes lifted to mine. The hard-guarded look was gone, replaced by something softer, something that might have been surprise. Then it was gone, and she straightened up, adjusting the jug on her hip. The climb back to the dugout was slow and arduous, but the air between us had changed. It was still fragile, still laced with caution, but a single tenuous thread of connection had been spun. A silent agreement had been forged on the icy bank of that creek. She would not push me out. I would not leave. That night, as she set out 2 bowls of bean stew on the dirt floor, she pushed the slightly larger one toward me. I noticed, and when I slid a portion of my own share back into the pot without a word, I saw in the flicker of her eyes that she noticed too. The next morning came with a hard frost that painted the canyon in shades of silver and gray. The edges of the creek were thick with ice, and the dugout door was stiff in its frame. I woke to the familiar scrape of her knife stirring the pot and the knowledge that questions had been turning over in my mind all night. Why was she still here? What had she done that was so unforgiving? How had one woman survived a place that had nearly killed me in 3 days? I sat up slowly, my ribs a cage of fire. You said they would finish what they started. I began, my voice rough with sleep. What did they start? Tala, her eyes remained fixed on the bubbling pot. For a long time I thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was devoid of emotion, a flat recitation of facts. They call me a traitor, she said. I spoke against a raid on a traitor's wagon. I argued that more bloodshed would only bring more soldiers. I gave a piece of my own bread to a white man who was starving. To them, that was the final betrayal. She paused and her hand tightened on the knife. They tied me to a post in the center of the village for a day and a night. When they cut me down, the chief told me to walk and never return. He said the spirits had turned their faces from me. I watched her face, searching for a flicker of self-pity, and found none. There was only a cold, hard resolve. She had told herself this story so many times it had become a scar, not a wound. But the tight line of her jaw told me the memory still burned. I didn't press her. Instead, I asked the other question that had been nagging at me. How do you have enough food? I see beans and some dried herbs, but that can't be enough for 4 months. For the first time, the corner of her mouth tugged upward in something that was almost a smile, though it held no humor. You think I live only on what you see? I have snares for rabbits along the creek. Sometimes a stray goat wanders down from the high country. And the traders, they pass by the north end of the canyon when the snow is not too deep. I am small. I am quiet. I take what I need. Her dark eyes flicked to mine. I am not too proud to steal to stay alive. I gave a single slow nod. I respected that. Survival didn't have room for pride. After our meager breakfast, she handed me a short-handled axe. The head was dull, but the hickory handle was solid. Wood, she said simply. We will always need more. I followed her outside into the biting cold. The canyon stretched before us, a vast, silent cathedral of rock and snow. I squared my shoulders and set the axe to a dead-weathered block of juniper. The first swing sent a jolt of agony through my ribs, and I clenched my teeth to keep from crying out. But I kept at it, the rhythm of the work a kind of penance. Swing, bite, chip. Swing, bite, chip. Tala watched me for a time, her arms crossed the clay jug balanced on her hip. She scanned the sky, the rim, every shadow. I realized then that she never, ever relaxed. Her entire being was coiled in a state of constant vigilance. At one point she came closer, showing me how to stack brush against the dugout wall to insulate it from the snow. Her hand brushed against mine as we worked, a brief, fleeting contact. And this time she was the one who didn't pull away. I caught the scent of her hair, wood smoke, and clean, cold earth, and felt a strange lightness in my chest. By midday we made the trip to the creek again. The ice was thicker now. As Tala leaned over to break it, her foot slipped on the slick stone. I caught her around the waist, pulling her back against me before she could fall into the frigid water. For a long moment she stayed there, her body flush against mine, her breath coming in quick, startled puffs. Her head tilted back, and her eyes wide and guarded rose to meet mine. In their dark depths, I saw a flicker of something new, not just surprise, but a raw, unguarded vulnerability. It was a look that said she wasn't used to being caught, wasn't used to being held. Then she pushed herself away, her composure returning like a mask. But something had shifted between us, an invisible line had been crossed. We both knew it. When we returned to the dugout, she set out the 2 bowls of beans. As before, she pushed the larger portion toward me, but this time when I slid some of it back to her side of the fire, she gave me a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It was a fragile, fleeting thing, but it lit her face from within. The silence that settled between us that night wasn't one of suspicion or caution. It was the quiet beginning of trust. A rough, unspoken thing being built, one shared task, one steadying hand, one faint smile at a time. I understood then that neither of us was going to ask the other to leave. Not yet. And for the first time in more years than I could count, I felt the pull of something that felt dangerously like belonging. The 4th morning brought a wind that had teeth. I rose stiffly, my body a roadmap of aches, and noticed the dugout was colder than it had been before. A thin line of fresh snow had been forced through a seam in the clay-packed roof, and a sliver of frigid air sliced through the smoky warmth. I thought about the days since my arrival, the wood I'd split, the water I'd carried, the cracks I'd helped patch, and a new set of questions formed in my mind. How could this small shelter truly withstand the full force of winter? And what other dangers besides the cold pressed in on the edges of this isolated canyon? I voiced the first question as I worked pressing fresh clay into the crack. How long can this place hold if a real blizzard hits? Tala was kneeling by the fire, her hair pulled back in a single thick braid. She glanced up at the roof, then back at me. Long enough, she said. The trappers who dug it knew their work. I mend it after every storm. She paused. Alone is harder. But when you are alone, no one can tell you to leave. The way she said it, I knew she wasn't just talking about the dugout. The loneliness was a fortress she had built around herself. And what about them? I asked, my voice low. The ones who cast you out. Do they ever come this way? Her jaw tensed. For a moment she was silent, her focus entirely on the fire. Sometimes, she finally said so quietly I almost didn't hear her. Scouting parties. They look for game, for signs of enemies. I watched the rim. Her words were still hanging in the air when I stepped outside to bring in a load of the wood I'd chopped. As I straightened up, my eyes instinctively went to the canyon rim high above, and my blood ran cold. 3 figures on horseback. They were stark black silhouettes against the pale gray sky. They were too far away to make out any details, but I knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in my gut that they were not strangers. They were her people. They lingered for a long, tense moment, their gaze sweeping the canyon floor below before the curve of the wall swallowed them from view. I carried the wood inside my face, set like stone. Tala looked at me and she knew. She didn't need me to say a word. Her own face became a pale, stoic mask. She moved to the door, slid the heavy bar into place, and then went to the raised sleeping shelf. She lifted a flat stone that I hadn't noticed before, revealing a hidden hollow beneath. From it she withdrew a small, powerful-looking bow, a handful of flint-tipped arrows, and a small carved wooden charm. She pressed the charm to her lips for a moment before placing it carefully back in the hollow. I watched her, a new and profound unease settling over me. I had seen this dugout as a shelter, a refuge. Now I saw it for what it also was, a trap. One way in, one way out. The thought of leaving, of vanishing into the wilderness to spare her the danger I represented, rose in my mind. But it felt wrong. I had eaten her food, warmed myself by her fire, accepted her care. To walk away now would be to leave her to face those riders alone. It was the act of a coward. They saw nothing, she said finally, though her voice was thin and strained. The snow hides the tracks. It hides the smoke. I sat by the fire, my jaw tight. I pulled my Colt from its holster under my coat, checked the cylinder out of habit, then wrapped it in a piece of oilcloth and tucked it beneath my bedroll by the wall. If they come, I'll stay out of sight, I said. But if they try to come through that door, she cut me off with a sharp look. If they come, we hide you. They will not spare me if they find a white man here. Her words were a cold, hard truth. Hiding me was already a risk that could cost her life. Still, she hadn't told me to go. As dusk fell, a heavy sense of foreboding settled over our small shelter. I took my turn patching the roof with more clay and brush while Tala ground dried beans into a coarse meal. Her movements were jerky, her eyes constantly flicking toward the barred door, her ears straining for any sound. Later, as we sat by the fire, she noticed me watching her. The firelight played across the planes of her face, catching the warm glow of her skin, where the torn dress slipped from her shoulder. She met my gaze and held it a long, unblinking look that held 1,000 unspoken questions. That night we settled on our separate sides of the fire, but the space between us felt charged. Tala lay with her back to me, but I could tell from the rigid line of her body that she wasn't sleeping. I lay awake for hours, listening to the wind moan at the door, thinking of the riders on the rim. Had they seen something? A wisp of smoke? A new track? Would they be back tomorrow? And I wondered if my arrival had sealed her fate, if she had managed to survive here all this time only to be discovered because of me. But another, more selfish thought followed close behind. For the first time in years, I didn't want to keep running. I wanted to stay. I wanted to stand my ground. Here in this hole in the earth with this woman who was as much of an outcast as I was. The snow came again that night, a thick, wet blanket that muffled the world in silence. The dugout groaned under the added weight. I lay awake, listening, my ribs a dull ache, where the cold had sunk deep into the bone. I could hear Tala's breathing just a few feet away, shallow and quick. She never truly slept, I realized. She was always on guard, always listening. How had she endured 4 months of this without being driven mad by the fear and the solitude? By morning, the dugout was half buried. The door was wedged shut by a massive drift. I put my shoulder to it, grunting with the effort until the frozen snow gave way with a groan, spilling a wave of white powder onto the floor. Pain, sharp and electric, flared in my side. Tala was there instantly, adding her own strength, her small hands flat against the wood. Together we forced an opening wide enough to crawl through. The air outside was so cold it felt like breathing crushed glass. We worked in a grim, focused silence for the first hour, clearing a path, our breath pluming in the frigid air. At one point she stopped, leaning on the shovel I'd fashioned from a piece of plank. She stared at me, her dark eyes intense. "Why do you stay, Caleb?" she asked, her voice sharp. "You saw the riders. You know the danger." I leaned on the handle of my axe, catching my own breath, the cold air burning my lungs. The question had been circling between us since yesterday. Because I've been running for too long, I said, the words coming out rough and honest. "There's nothing for me out there. No camp, no town, no home. Just more of what's behind me. If I leave now, I'm just running back to nothing." Her gaze remained on me, steady and searching. "And if they find you here, if they kill me for hiding you, then I'll answer for myself." I said, my voice low but firm. "Not you." She didn't argue. She didn't agree. She simply turned back to her work, her jaw set in that stubborn line I was beginning to know well. Later that day, after the work was done, we sat by the fire while she mended her dress. She used a bone needle and thread made from sinew, her fingers calloused and strong, moving with a practiced skill. I watched those hands and realized she had almost nothing left in this world. One dress, one blanket, this dugout. And still she had shared it all with a half-dead stranger. "What do you do?" I asked, breaking the long silence. "When you're alone here? When there's no snow to clear, no wood to chop?" She looked up as if surprised by the personal nature of the question. "I watch," she said. "I think. Sometimes. I sing. Quietly so no one can hear." Her lips pressed together. "Sometimes I talk to myself so I do not forget the sound of a voice." I nodded slowly. I understood that kind of loneliness. It could chew on a man's soul worse than hunger. The hours passed in small shared tasks. She showed me where she'd set her snares along the creek bed, hidden beneath blankets of snow. We reset one together, my large, clumsy hands brushing against hers as we worked the wire loop. She didn't pull away. The silence between us had changed again. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the comfortable quiet of two people who had fallen into a rhythm, who no longer needed to explain every move. That night she sat closer to the fire than usual, so close our knees almost touched. The dugout felt smaller, the air thicker, warmer. She leaned against the wall and her shoulder brushed against my arm. A simple, accidental touch, but it felt grounding. My chest tightened, not from pain this time, but from the unfamiliar feeling of someone willingly choosing to be near me. She spoke, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. "If they come back, we must be ready." I turned my head, the firelight catching the sharp planes of her face, a loose strand of hair falling against her cheek. "We will be," I promised. For a long time, neither of us moved. The fire popped and hissed, and outside the wind howled its lonely song. I thought of the vast, aching emptiness I had carried inside me for so long and how strange it was to feel it slowly filling up here in this narrow space carved from stone. Tala, I knew, was thinking of the immense risk she had taken by pulling me from the snow and perhaps how she no longer wished she had left me there. Then, under the cover of the blanket that lay across my lap, she reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were warm and strong. She simply left her hand there, a silent, profound gesture. I closed my own fingers around hers, and for the first time since we had met, I felt both of us exhale a breath we hadn't realized we'd been holding. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of my stomach, but for now it was held at bay by the simple, solid warmth of her hand in mine. The great storm passed, and in its wake the world was remade in brilliant, blinding white. The dugout door groaned under the weight of the snowbank, which was now nearly as high as my chest. I had to climb out first, my boots sinking deep, and use the axe handle to carve a narrow path. Tala followed the clay jug in her hand, her breath coming in sharp white bursts. For the first time since I'd arrived, I saw a genuine smile touch her lips. She slipped and fell waist-deep into a soft drift. And when she pulled herself out sputtering, she shook her head and shot me a look that was almost playful, a dare for me to comment. The simple human moment struck me. Could we, a banished Apache woman and a broken-down, war-weary drifter, truly build something here? Could trust born of shared hardship be strong enough to hold against the weight of the world that had cast us both out? I didn't have the answer, but something in my chest, something I had thought long dead, was beginning to hope. At the creek, the ice was a thick, solid sheet. I used the butt of the axe to smash a hole while Tala knelt close, scooping the frigid water into the jug. When she handed it up to me, her fingers brushed against my glove. They were trembling with cold. For a moment, she let her hand rest there before pulling it back. No words were needed. Back in the dugout, our clothes were stiff with frost. Tala quickly stripped off her wet blanket, hanging it near the fire to dry. I sat on the ground, rubbing my hands together, my side a dull, throbbing ache. I saw she was shivering her teeth, chattering silently. Without thinking, I took off my greatcoat, the one piece of quality gear I had left, and held it out to her. She stared at it, then at me, her eyes narrowing. "You'll freeze." I've frozen before, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. "Just don't make me sit here and watch you do it." She hesitated for another long moment, then she took it. She slipped it on over her torn dress, and the heavy wool coat swallowed her small frame. The sleeves hung down past her hands, the shoulders were far too broad, but the way she pulled it tight around herself, the way she closed her eyes for a second, as the warmth enveloped her, was more thanks than any words could have been. She settled near the fire, her gaze dropping to the glowing embers, her lips pressed together, as if holding back a wave of emotion. I leaned back against the wall, studying her, the questions returning. Why hadn't she left this place? Surely there were other tribes, other places she could go. I finally asked her, my voice quiet in the small space. "You could have gone anywhere, Tala. South, to the warmer lands. Why stay here?" Her dark eyes lifted to mine, and they were filled with a fierce, weary pride. "And where would I go, Caleb? To the people who call me traitor and spit on the ground I walk. To the white man's towns where they would look at me with hate in their eyes because of the color of my skin." Here she swept a hand around the close-stayed, small, smoky dugout. "No one tells me I do not belong." The truth of her words hit me hard. I understood it more than I wanted to admit. I too had nowhere left to belong. No one waiting, no one to call me home. For both of us, this canyon wasn't a choice. It was the last place on earth the world hadn't yet taken from us. As night fell, the fire burned low, casting long dancing shadows on the stone walls. Tala sat beside me, so close now that her knee brushed against mine. The greatcoat hung open at her chest where a button was missing, and the firelight caught the delicate line of her collarbone and the soft curve of her throat. I tried not to stare, but the air between us was different now, charged with a new and potent energy that made the silence feel louder than speech. She shifted her braid, slipping over her shoulder, and her eyes found mine. For a long, breathless moment, we just looked at each other. All the fear, all the loneliness, all the hardship of the past weeks seemed to press into the small space between us. Then slowly, deliberately, she leaned in and pressed her lips to mine. It was a tentative kiss at first light and uncertain a question. I answered it without hesitation, my hand rising to cup her jaw, my calloused thumb stroking the soft skin of her cheek. The kiss deepened, careful but sure, a slow burn of heat mixing with the sound of our mingled breaths. Her hand slid up to my chest, her fingers pressing against the old scar beneath my shirt as if to reassure herself that I was real, that this moment was real. I drew her closer, my other arm wrapping around her waist. For the first time since I had stumbled half dead into this canyon, the constant grinding ache of survival gave way to something else entirely, something that felt like hope. Something that for the first time in a very long time made perfect sense. When we finally pulled apart, we stayed close, our foreheads nearly touching. She whispered, her breath warm against my lips. "You can go when the thaw comes." I could, I answered, my voice low and steady. "But I won't." She searched my face, her dark eyes wide as if weighing the truth of my words. Then she let out a long, slow breath, and instead of pulling away, she settled against me, her head resting on my shoulder. My arm tightened around her. The fire crackled. The wind moved like a ghost across the canyon rim. And for the first time, the dugout felt less like a place to hide and more like a place to live. The stillness of the next day was unnerving. The kind of dead quiet that makes the hair on your arms stand up. The snow had hardened to a brittle crust overnight, and the canyon was silent, save for the distant mournful call of a crow. I rose before Tala stirred and stepped outside. My boots crunched loudly on the icy surface as I went to check the path we had cleared. I scanned the canyon rim out of habit, and then I saw them. Tracks. Not ours. Fresh tracks pressed deep into the new snow. At least 3 horses. They had passed by in the night. When I ducked back inside, Tala was sitting up by the fire, her hair a dark cloud around her shoulders. She took one look at my face and her own grew tense. "Riders," she stated. It wasn't a question. I nodded grimly. "Passed by on the rim. In the night. They might come back." Her eyes dropped to the fire, and for a long moment she was perfectly still. Then she rose, pulling her blanket tightly around her. "Then we prepare. How could we possibly defend this place? A hole in the rock with one door and no escape. What would happen if her people discovered she was sheltering a white man?" The questions hammered in my mind. Tala gave me the answers, not with words, but with action. She knelt by the sleeping shelf, pulled the flat stone aside, and retrieved her bow and arrows. She handed me a short, heavy knife with a blade that was dull but serviceable. "If they come inside," she said, her voice. "A low, urgent command, you fight. Only if there is no other choice. If they find you, they will kill us both without a question." I studied her face, thrown into stark relief by the firelight. And what if they already suspect? What if they're coming back to be sure? "Then I lie," she said. Simply, her chin held high. "I tell them I am alone. I tell them you were never here." Her jaw tightened. "And you will stay hidden, Caleb. No matter what you hear, you must promise me." I wanted to argue, to tell her I wouldn't cower in a hole while she faced them alone. But I knew she was right. This wasn't about pride or honor. This was about living to see another sunrise. "I promise," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I slid the knife into my boot and placed my revolver back under my bedroll, wrapping it tightly in its cloth. We didn't have to wait long. By midday, the faint rhythmic sound of hoofbeats reached us, echoing off the canyon walls. My chest clenched. Tala stood by the door, listening, her body as taut as a drawn bowstring. She motioned for me to get behind the curtain of furs that sectioned off the sleeping shelf. It was a flimsy hiding place, but it was all we had. The sound grew louder. A man's voice called out in the Apache tongue. Tala answered, her voice calm and steady, betraying none of the terror I felt coiling in my gut. From my hiding place, I heard the scrape of boots on stone. I heard them questioning her, their voices sharp and suspicious. They asked about the extra woodpile, about the second set of tracks they'd seen from the rim, my tracks from the day before. I heard her lie, her voice a smooth, cool river of deception. She told them she had been reinforcing her shelter against the storms, that the other tracks belonged to a lame wolf she had chased away. I held my breath, my hand gripping the handle of the knife in my boot. Then a heavy knock rattled the door. "Let us see for ourselves, traitor." I saw Tala's back stiffen. Then she slowly, deliberately lifted the bar. 3 men pushed their way inside, their size seeming to shrink the small space to nothing. They looked around with open contempt, kicking at her meager belongings. One of them, a young, arrogant brave with cruel eyes, strode directly toward the sleeping shelf. He reached out a hand and grabbed the edge of the fur curtain. My heart hammered against my ribs. My muscles coiled, ready to spring. This was it. But just as he was about to rip the curtain down, the oldest of the 3, a man with a scarred face and weary eyes, barked an order at him. They exchanged sharp words in their own language. The younger man reluctantly dropped the curtain and stepped back. After another long, tense moment of scanning the dugout, they seemed satisfied. They turned and left without another word, their parting looks filled with menace. I waited until the sound of their horses faded completely before I emerged. My shirt was soaked with sweat. I found Tala leaning against the barred door, her body trembling with the aftermath of her terror and bravery. She gave a single ragged shudder before she mastered herself. I crossed the space in 2 strides and put a hand on her arm. She looked up at me, her eyes wet but blazing with a fierce, unyielding fire. "They will come again," she whispered, her voice raw. "They never forget a grievance." I shook my head, my grip on her arm tightening. "Then we'll be ready next time," I said, my own voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "Both of us." She looked at me then, a long, searching gaze. And for the first time, she didn't try to push me away. She didn't retreat behind her walls of pride and solitude. We were no longer 2 strangers caught in a storm. We were bound together now by choice, by danger, and by the silent promise that neither of us would face what was coming alone. The air in the dugout remained heavy long after the riders had gone. We both knew they would be back, and next time they would not be so easily fooled. How could we defend this place? Why, after seeing the immediate mortal danger, did I remain? Tala was the one who broke the tense silence. "We cannot just wait for them to come back," she said, her voice regaining its strength. "If they decide to search this place properly, they will find you." I looked into the fire, my jaw tight. I thought of all the years I had spent running, leaving every town, every camp, every shallow connection behind. "I have nowhere else to go, Tala," I said quietly. "And I'm done running." "Then we make this place stronger," she declared. Her plan began at the back wall of the dugout. She showed me a section of softer, sedimentary rock she had noticed. Using her knife, the dull axe head, and our bare hands, we began to dig. It was brutal, exhausting work. Hours bled into one another. Our fingers were raw and bleeding, our muscles screaming in protest. But slowly, a narrow tunnel began to take shape, an escape route, leading upward, angling toward a small brush-covered ledge high on the canyon wall. I braced the tunnel with willow poles we cut from the creek bed, while Tala packed the sides with wet clay to keep it from collapsing. When it was finally finished, we crawled through it, emerging into the cold, clean air on the hidden ledge. Looking down at our small shelter, we both felt a profound sense of relief. We would not be trapped like animals in a cage. We didn't stop there. I cut twice as much wood as before, stacking it high against the outside wall to create a false barrier. Tala gathered heavy stones from the creek, arranging them in piles near the door, ready to be used as weapons or to block the entrance. As she worked, she told me about her father. "He was a scout," she said, her voice soft with memory. "Before they cast me out, he taught me many things. He always said a home must never have only one way out. I thought I would never have a need for his lessons, but I kept them. As night fell, we sat by the fire, our bodies aching with exhaustion, but our spirits lighter than they had been in days. Tala's braid had come loose and strands of black hair fell across her face. She was wearing my greatcoat again, and she didn't seem to notice or care that the torn dress beneath it slipped open at the neckline. The quiet between us was no longer about survival. It was about partnership. "You could still leave," she said, her voice a low murmur. "Take the tunnel. Be gone before they return. No one would blame you." I let out a long, slow breath. My hands throbbed, my ribs ached, but none of it mattered as much as the thought of walking away from her. "I've had enough of leaving Tala," I said. "I've left towns, I've left jobs, I've left graves behind me." "Not this time." She studied my face in the firelight, searching for any hint of hesitation, and found none. Slowly, she leaned closer until her head came to rest against my shoulder. My arm went around her, instinctively holding her close. She stayed there, her breathing finally evening out into the slow, deep rhythm of true sleep. The fire burned low. I felt her weight against me, a warm, solid, and precious thing. I knew then that this dugout was no longer just her shelter or my refuge. It was ours. And for the first time since I had staggered into this canyon, the thought of tomorrow did not feel like something to dread. It felt like something worth fighting for. The thaw came slowly in drips and trickles from the canyon rim that cut glistening channels in the snow. Tala and I worked each day, clearing the path, checking the tunnel, sharing the endless tasks of survival as if we had been doing so for a lifetime. But a question hung in the air between us, unspoken but ever present. What happens when they return? The answer came on a bright, cold afternoon. The sound of hooves, not distant this time, but close. Too close. I peered through a crack in the door. 5 riders, not 3. Their voices were sharp, angry. They were not passing by. They were searching. Tala's face went pale, but her eyes were like chips of flint. She pulled the bar from the door and turned to me, her voice a fierce whisper. "The tunnel, Caleb. Now. If they find you." My jaw clenched. "I'm not leaving you to face them alone." Her eyes burned into mine. "If you show yourself, we both die. If you let me speak, maybe we live. Go." The truth of her words was a bitter pill, but I swallowed it. I slid back into the narrow opening of our escape route, pulling a hide over the entrance. I had the knife in my boot and my revolver in my hand. Through a small gap, I watched as Tala opened the door. The men dismounted, pushing their way inside their leader, accusing her of hiding someone. He pointed to the fresh work on the dugout, the new woodpile. Tala stood before them, small and defiant, her voice ringing with a strength that made my heart ache. "This is my shelter," she said. "I keep it strong. I keep no one here. You can look, but you will find nothing but me." They tore the place apart. My heart hammered against my ribs as one of them stopped inches from my hiding place, his hand reaching for the hide, but another called him away. It seemed for a moment that they would leave, but the youngest, the one with the cruel eyes, lingered. He sneered at her, asking how she had survived so long alone. It was a threat dressed as a question. Tala lifted her chin. "Because I am stronger than you think." The man took a step toward her, but the leader barked an order. With one last venomous look, they turned and left. The sound of their hooves faded, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. I crawled out, my body trembling with contained violence. I found Tala leaning against the doorframe, her shoulders shaking. I went to her, my hands finding her arms, pulling her into an embrace. She clung to me, her face buried in my chest. We stood like that for a long time, holding each other up. When we finally pulled apart, the fire had burned down to embers. "We can't just wait for them to come again," I said, my voice hoarse. "This has to be more than a hiding place. It has to be a home." Tala looked at me, her eyes searching my face. She saw no weakness there, only resolve. She nodded slowly. "Then we stay. Together." That evening we ate our meal of beans and rabbit side by side. Afterwards I took a charred stick from the fire and began to sketch a plan in the dirt floor. A place to divert water from the creek for a small garden when the ground thawed. A place to cut a second larger shelf into the wall. A place off to the side to set a cradle board if the time ever came. Tala watched me, and the faintest of smiles touched her lips. "You speak like a man who already belongs here." I looked up from my drawings and met her gaze. "I do," I answered without a moment's hesitation. "With you." Night fell. The storm outside had broken, and the canyon was quiet, breathing under a blanket of stars. The riders might come again. The world might still rage beyond the rim, but inside the dugout a choice had been made. I was no longer a drifter. Tala was no longer an exile. We were two souls who had found a shelter in the storm and in each other. It was no longer just stone and fire. It was a life built from the ashes of our pasts, held together by the simple, powerful decision to stay. And that was an ending that felt for the first time in a very long time like a true beginning. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.